In
The air
that
in
moment,
Camden,
Emily
Maine,
realized
was
that
crisp,
Max's legacy
carrying
wasn't
the faint
just
scent
in the
of salt
lives he
water
had
from the
saved.
bay.
It was
Emily
in the
Parker,
hearts he had
28,
touched, stood
most
by
of
the
all.
window of her small, weathered cottage, her green eyes distant and tired. In her arms, 11-month-old Lily clutched a threadbare bunny, babbling softly. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, highlighting the worn wooden floors and the half-finished mug of coffee sitting untouched on the counter. It was another day in a string of days Emily could barely tell apart. Before everything fell apart, Emily had been someone else entirely. She'd been full of life, laughter, and plans for the future. That was when Michael, her husband, was alive. They had met in Boston. He was an artist with a passion for seascapes, and she was a freelance writer who loved his ability to turn ordinary scenes into extraordinary moments. When they married, they'd moved to this quiet corner of Maine to start a family, seeking simplicity and peace. But the life they had dreamed of had crumbled on a cold February night. Michael had gone out to pick up groceries, a last-minute trip before the snowstorm rolled in. He never came back. The officer's voice on the phone had been clinical but kind, explaining that Michael's car had skidded on black ice and collided with a tree. Emily had collapsed to the floor, the phone slipping from her hand. Lily's cries had filled the house, echoing Emily's own grief. Now, 8 months later, Emily lived in a kind of haze. The cottage, once a warm and inviting place, felt like a shell. Michael's easel still stood in the corner of the living room, his last painting unfinished. She hadn't been able to bring herself to move it. His favorite coffee mug sat untouched on the kitchen counter, a small symbol of the life they had shared. Emily's days were a rigid routine, a fragile structure that kept her moving forward. Each morning, she bundled Lily up for a walk along the bay, the fresh air giving her a fleeting sense of calm. The afternoons were filled with chores and Lily's naps, and the evenings were spent reading bedtime stories in a soft, sing-song voice. It was a lonely life, but it was all Emily knew. One afternoon, Sarah, her closest friend from town, stopped by with a bag of groceries. Sarah had been a lifeline for Emily in those early days after Michael's death, but Emily's grief had driven her to retreat more and more into herself. "Emily," Sarah said gently, unpacking the groceries onto the counter, "you've got to let people help you. You can't keep doing this all on your own." "I'm fine," Emily replied, her voice clipped. She avoided Sarah's gaze, focusing instead on organizing Lily's bottles on the drying rack. "Fine." Sarah's voice was tinged with frustration. "You're barely getting by. I can see it, and I know you feel it. You've got to talk to someone. A therapist, maybe?" Emily shook her head. "I can't afford that right now, and even if I could, I don't have time. Lily needs me." "Lily needs you to be okay," Sarah said firmly, stepping closer. "You're strong, Em, but no one can carry all of this alone." Emily's hands tightened around the edge of the counter. She hated feeling this exposed, her vulnerability laid bare in front of someone else. "I appreciate your concern, Sarah, but I'm doing the best I can," Sarah sighed, realizing the conversation wouldn't go any further. "Okay," she said softly, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "But I'm here. Whenever you're ready." After Sarah left, Emily sat on the couch, holding Lily close as the baby gurgled and played with her bunny. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pressed her cheek against Lily's soft curls. "It's just us, baby girl," she whispered. "But we'll make it. I promise." The words felt hollow, even to herself, but they were all she had. The late summer sun hung low in the sky as Emily pushed Lily's stroller along the narrow path near Camden Bay. The air was warm, with a soft breeze carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. This daily walk was Emily's moment of reprieve, a chance to breathe, think, and feel a little more human. Lily babbled happily in her stroller, occasionally pointing at seagulls circling above. "Look, Lily," Emily said, trying to sound cheerful. "The birds are flying home, just like we'll do soon." As she rounded a bend in the trail, something caught her eye. A flash of gold moved in the tall grass by the edge of the path. At first, Emily thought it was a trick of the light, but then she heard a faint whimper. Stopping the stroller, she leaned forward to get a better look. That's when she saw him. A large golden retriever lay half hidden in the grass, his ribs showing through his matted fur. His coat, once glossy, was now dirty and tangled, and his eyes, a soulful amber, were fixed on her with a mix of fear and hope. He let out another soft whine, shifting slightly but staying low to the ground as if unsure whether she was friend or foe. Emily's heart clenched. "Oh, no," she murmured, glancing at Lily, who had gone quiet, her big hazel eyes staring at the dog. Emily hesitated. She wasn't sure how safe it was to approach a stray dog, especially with a baby in tow. But the desperation in the dog's eyes was impossible to ignore. She crouched down a few feet away, keeping her voice low and soothing. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. I won't hurt you." The dog's ears perked up slightly, but he didn't move. Emily noticed a thin piece of rope tied around his neck, frayed as if it had been chewed through. Someone had abandoned him, she realized, anger flaring in her chest. Who could leave a creature so vulnerable? Emily opened the small bag she always carried for Lily and pulled out a granola bar. "You must be starving," she said, unwrapping it. She held out a piece, staying as still as possible. The dog sniffed the air, his nose twitching. Slowly, he crawled closer, his movements cautious and deliberate. When he was close enough, he gingerly took the piece of granola from her hand and backed away to eat it. "There you go," Emily said softly. "That's better, isn't it?" For a few minutes, she stayed there, feeding him small pieces of the bar and speaking gently. Lily clapped her hands and giggled, as if encouraging the dog. Finally, when the granola bar was gone, the dog stood up shakily, his tail wagging just a little. Emily could see how thin he was, his body trembling from exhaustion. "You need help, don't you?" she said, more to herself than to him. Taking a deep breath, she stood and gestured toward the stroller. "I can't just leave you here. Let's get you home." The dog hesitated but didn't run when she reached out to untie the rope around his neck. Instead, he let out a low, relieved sigh, as if he understood she meant no harm. Emily looped the rope loosely like a leash and started walking. To her surprise, the dog followed, staying close to the stroller. When they reached the cottage, Emily led the dog into the small backyard. "Wait here, okay?" she said, tying the rope to the porch railing. "I'll get you some water." Inside, Lily fussed in her high chair as Emily filled a bowl with water and grabbed a leftover chicken breast from the fridge. She returned to find the dog lying down, his eyes half closed. When he saw her, he sat up, his tail thumping against the porch. "There you go, big guy," she said, placing the water and chicken in front of him. He devoured the food quickly but with surprising gentleness, as if he knew this might be his only meal for a while. Emily watched him, her chest tight with emotion. "What am I going to do with you?" she whispered. For the first time in months, as the dog looked up at her with those grateful eyes, Emily felt a glimmer of something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the modest space. Emily stood by the counter, pouring coffee into her favorite mug, Michael's mug. She glanced outside, where the golden dog, now named Max, lounged on the small porch. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady, and for the first time since she had found him, his body looked relaxed. "Max," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head with a soft smile. The name had come to her unexpectedly the previous night as she watched him curl up beside the couch. It felt right, strong, simple, and fitting for a dog that had already brought an inexplicable sense of calm to her turbulent world. Lily squealed from her playpen, waving a plush bunny in the air. Emily chuckled, walking over to scoop her up. "Good morning, little one. Ready to meet your new friend?" Carrying Lily on her hip, Emily stepped outside. Max perked up immediately, his tail thumping against the wooden planks of the porch. Lily let out a delighted shriek, reaching out toward him. Emily hesitated. She knew very little about Max's past, but so far, he'd shown nothing but gentleness. "Okay, Max," she said cautiously, lowering herself to sit on the steps with Lily in her lap. "Let's see how this goes." Max wagged his tail as he approached, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, his amber eyes fixed on Lily. The baby, curious and fearless, leaned forward, her tiny hand outstretched. Emily held her breath as Max sniffed Lily's hand, then gently licked her fingers. Lily giggled, clapping her hands. "Doggy!" she exclaimed, her voice high-pitched with excitement. Emily let out a relieved laugh. "That's right, sweetheart. That's Mac." Over the next few days, Max settled into their lives as if he had always been part of the family. Emily set up a makeshift bed for him in the corner of the living room, though he often chose to sleep by the door, his head resting on his paws as if keeping watch. He followed Emily and Lily everywhere, his presence a quiet reassurance. One afternoon, as Emily folded laundry in the living room, she noticed Max lying on the floor with Lily. The baby was babbling nonsensically, occasionally patting Max's fur. He remained perfectly still, his tail wagging softly each time she touched him. "You're good with her," Emily said aloud, more to herself than to Max. The dog glanced at her, his ears twitching as if he understood. "Better than I expected." That night, as Emily prepared dinner, Sarah stopped by unannounced. She stepped into the kitchen, her eyebrows shooting up at the sight of Max stretched out on the floor. "Well, hello," Sarah said, placing a bag of groceries on the counter. "And who's this handsome fellow?" "Max," Emily replied, smiling as she chopped vegetables. "I found him by the bay last week. He was in rough shape." Sarah crouched down to pet Max, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. "You took him in? That's unexpected." Emily shrugged. "He needed help. And honestly, I think I needed him too." Sarah looked up at her friend, her expression softening. "You've been smiling more. That's good to see." Emily paused, the knife hovering over the cutting board. "He's been good for Lily. And for me, I guess. He makes the house feel less empty." Later that evening, after Sarah had left and Lily was asleep in her crib, Emily sat on the couch with a book. Max lay at her feet, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm. She reached down, running her fingers through his softening fur. "Thank you, Max," she whispered, "for being here. For everything." Max shifted slightly, his tail thumping once against the floor. Emily smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Michael's death, the house didn't feel so silent. It felt like home. The late morning sun shimmered on the surface of Camden Bay, casting golden ripples across the water. Emily tightened her grip on Lily's stroller as they navigated the sandy trail leading to the beach. Max trotted beside them, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. His leash dangled loosely from Emily's hand. He rarely strayed far from her side. The beach was one of Emily's favorite places, even now. The sound of waves crashing against the shore, the distant cries of seagulls, and the salty breeze had a way of clearing her mind. For Lily, it was an endless playground of textures and sounds. Emily was determined to give her daughter moments of joy, even if her own heart still felt heavy. "Look at the water, Lily," Emily said, kneeling to unbuckle her from the stroller. Lily squealed, wriggling with excitement as her little feet touched the sand. She bent down, grabbing a fistful of sand and letting it sift through her fingers, her eyes wide with wonder. Max stayed close, sniffing the air and wagging his tail. He was watchful, his gaze shifting constantly between Emily, Lily, and the gentle waves lapping at the shore. Emily smiled, marveling at how quickly Max had become an integral part of their lives. She spread out a blanket on the sand and sat down, pulling a book from her bag. "Don't wander too far, Lily," she said, her voice light but firm. Lily was too young to understand, but the tone seemed to register. She stayed within a few feet, babbling to herself as she explored the sand. Max settled beside Emily, his body half leaning against her leg. She scratched behind his ears absent-mindedly, her eyes scanning the first few lines of her book. It was a rare moment of peace, a chance to breathe, to exist without the weight of grief pressing down on her chest. Minutes passed, and Emily became engrossed in her book. The sound of the waves lulled her, and for a moment, she let herself relax. She was so focused that she didn't notice Lily edging closer to the water. The toddler, drawn by the sparkle of the waves, had crawled past the edge of the blanket and was now only a few feet from the shore. Max's low, sharp bark broke through the tranquility. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes widening as she saw Lily sitting at the edge of the water, her tiny hands reaching out toward the incoming waves. A small swell rolled in, soaking Lily's legs and pulling her slightly forward. "Lily!" Emily shouted, scrambling to her feet. But before she could take more than a step, Max was already moving. The dog bolted toward Lily, his strong legs kicking up sand as he raced to her side. Another wave, slightly larger this time, surged forward, and Lily toppled over, her small body briefly submerged. Emily's heart leaped into her throat as she stumbled forward, her feet sinking into the soft sand. Max plunged into the shallow water, his movements swift and purposeful. He reached Lily in seconds, grabbing the back of her shirt gently with his teeth. With a determined tug, he pulled her upright, his body shielding her from the next wave. Lily coughed and sputtered, crying loudly, but she was safe. By the time Emily reached them, her legs shaking with adrenaline, Max had already dragged Lily back onto the damp sand. Emily dropped to her knees, scooping Lily into her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she held her daughter close, murmuring words of comfort. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's here." "You're okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. Max stood nearby, his fur dripping with seawater, his amber eyes fixed on Emily and Lily. He looked tired but resolute, his tail wagging slightly as if to reassure Emily that everything was fine now. Emily reached out with her free hand, running it through Max's wet fur. "Thank you, Max," she said, her voice breaking. "You're incredible." Max leaned into her touch, his eyes softening. For the first time since Michael's death, Emily felt the sharp pang of what it truly meant to love and be loved unconditionally. She stayed there on the beach, holding Lily and stroking Max, letting the enormity of the moment settle in. The waves continued their endless rhythm, but Emily no longer felt their pull. For now, her little family was safe. The sun had reached its zenith by the time Emily returned to the cottage with Lily and Max. She couldn't shake the memory of the waves dragging her daughter forward or the sheer determination in Max's eyes as he rushed to save her. The events of the morning clung to her, heavy and raw. After changing Lily into dry clothes and putting her down for a nap, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws. Every so often, he would glance up at her, as if checking to see if she was okay. "You really are something else, aren't you?" Emily said softly, her voice tinged with both gratitude and awe. Max's tail thumped once against the floor in response. Later that afternoon, the three of them ventured out again, this time to the local park. The park was near the bay, its grassy expanse dotted with families and dog owners enjoying the warm weather. Emily chose a quiet bench under a large oak tree, its shade offering a welcome reprieve from the sun. Lily was in her stroller, munching on a snack, while Max sat obediently by Emily's side. As she watched Lily happily kick her legs and giggle at the world around her, Emily's mind wandered back to the beach. The thought of what could have happened if Max hadn't been there sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't deny it anymore. Max wasn't just a companion. He was a protector. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Emily looked up to see an older woman holding a leash, her small terrier sniffing the ground eagerly. "Is that your dog?" Emily smiled, glancing at Max. "Yes. Well, sort of. He's been with us for about a week. He's beautiful," the woman said, her eyes softening. "And he looks so well behaved. You're lucky to have him." "I really am," Emily replied, her voice quieter. She reached down, scratching Max behind the ears. "He's more than I ever expected." As the woman walked away, Emily felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite place. In the span of a week, Max had gone from a stray to an irreplaceable part of her life. She realized she had stopped thinking of him as temporary. He was hers now, and she was his. The quiet of the park was interrupted by a loud splash. Emily turned her head sharply toward the sound. A small group had gathered near the edge of the bay, their voices rising in alarm. She couldn't make out the words, but their frantic gestures toward the water made it clear that something was wrong. Emily's heart raced. She stood, instinctively pulling Lily's stroller closer. Max, sensing her tension, stood as well, his body alert. "Help!" someone shouted from the group. "There's a kid in the water." Emily's breath caught. Without hesitation, Max bolted toward the commotion, his leash slipping from her hand. "Max!" she called, panic surging through her. But he was already gone, his golden form streaking across the grass and diving into the water with a splash. The group at the bay parted as Max swam toward a struggling boy, no more than 5 or 6 years old, who had drifted too far from shore. The boy's small arms flailed, his cries barely audible over the lapping waves. Max reached him in seconds, gripping the boy's shirt gently with his teeth. With powerful strokes, he began pulling the child back toward land. The scene felt surreal to Emily, her chest tight with both fear and hope. She pushed Lily's stroller closer to the shore, her eyes never leaving Max. The crowd erupted in cheers as Max reached the shallows, the boy clinging to him tightly. A man, presumably the boy's father, waded into the water to scoop him up, his face etched with relief and gratitude. Emily ran to Max, who was now standing in the shallow water, panting heavily. She knelt, wrapping her arms around his soaked body. "You did it again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're a hero, Mac." The boy's father approached, holding his son close. "That dog," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He saved my son. Thank you. Thank you so much." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Don't thank me," she said, stroking Max's wet fur. "It's all him." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. The local news station arrived afterward, spread quickly through the small town, and a reporter interviewed the boy's family and Emily. Max, however, remained oblivious to the attention, lying contentedly at Emily's feet. That night, as the house grew quiet and Lily slept soundly in her crib, Emily sat on the couch with Max beside her. She rested her hand on his head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You're not just a dog, Max," she said softly. "You're family." Max looked up at her with those amber eyes, his tail wagging gently. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily didn't feel alone. The next morning, the small cottage buzzed with a rare energy. Emily stood in the kitchen, watching Max as he stretched lazily in the sunlight streaming through the window. Lily, seated in her high chair, was covered in oatmeal, gleefully smearing it across her tray. The house, for once, felt alive, filled with laughter, movement, and a comforting sense of purpose. Emily couldn't stop replaying the events of the previous day. She had always thought of Max as special, but his bravery at the beach and at the bay had elevated him in her eyes. He wasn't just her companion. He was her protector, Lily's guardian, and somehow, the glue holding their small family together. She crouched down, placing a bowl of kibble on the floor. "Here you go, Max," she said, ruffling his fur as he ate. "You deserve every bit of this, and more." Her gratitude, however, went beyond words and gestures. That afternoon, she decided to do something she hadn't done in a long time. Step into town. Emily was usually hesitant about venturing out. Small-town life meant curious neighbors and unwanted conversations. But today felt different. She wanted to celebrate Max, to acknowledge the profound impact he'd had on her life. Bundling Lily into her stroller, she clipped Max's leash to his collar. "Ready, Max?" she asked, and his tail wagged enthusiastically. The three of them set off down the familiar path toward the heart of Camden. The town square was bustling with its usual charm. Colorful storefronts, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the bakery, and locals chatting on benches beneath the shade of old oak trees. As Emily approached, pushing Lily's stroller with Max walking proudly by her side, heads began to turn. "That's the dog," a voice called out. Emily looked up, startled, to see a woman from the park waving at her. Within moments, a small crowd had gathered around them, their faces alight with admiration and curiosity. Max seemed unfazed by the attention, his tail wagging gently as children reached out to pet him. "You're the one from the bay, right?" an older man asked. "With the dog that saved that boy?" Emily nodded, feeling her cheeks flush. "Yes, that was Max. He's incredible." The boy's father emerged from the crowd, his son holding his hand tightly. "There he is, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt in front of Max, meeting the dog's calm gaze. "Thank you, buddy. You saved my boy." The man turned to Emily, his eyes glistening. "And thank you, too, for raising such an amazing dog." Emily felt a lump in her throat. "I didn't raise him," she admitted. "I found him. He found us, really. I think. Maybe he was meant to." The crowd murmured in agreement, and someone suggested taking a photo. Emily hesitated but relented as a local photographer snapped a picture of Max sitting proudly beside Emily and Lily. Back at the cottage that evening, Emily sat on the porch steps, Max lying beside her while Lily napped inside. The air was cool and quiet, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. She reached down, running her hand through Max's fur. "You're famous now," she teased, smiling. "But don't let it go to your head." Max lifted his head slightly, his amber eyes meeting hers. She swore he understood her, the connection between them deeper than anything she'd experienced before. For months, she had felt lost, burdened by grief and uncertainty. But now, with Max by her side, she felt like she was starting to find herself again. Her thoughts drifted to Michael. She wished he could see this, see how Max had stepped into their lives at just the right moment. She closed her eyes, the weight of her emotions pressing against her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to Max, to Michael, or to the universe itself. Max shifted closer, resting his head on her lap. The gesture was simple but profound, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. Emily stroked his fur, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope for the future. And she knew that, whatever came next, Max would be there. Her protector, her hero, and, most importantly, her family. The following week, Camden was abuzz with excitement. The story of Max's heroics had spread like wildfire. It wasn't just talk at the local diner or murmurs at the grocery store. Max had become a genuine celebrity in the small town. Emily could hardly believe it when she received a call from the mayor's office, inviting her and Max to a special event in his honor. "We'd like to recognize Max for his bravery," the mayor's assistant had said. "It's not every day we get a hero like him in Camden." Emily hesitated. She wasn't the type to enjoy public attention, but this wasn't about her. Max deserved it. "We'll be there," she replied, glancing down at Max, who was lying by her feet. His tail wagged as if he understood. The day of the ceremony was bright and clear, the town square decorated with banners and balloons. A small stage had been set up in front of the courthouse, and a crowd had already gathered when Emily arrived with Max and Lily. Max walked confidently beside her, his tail wagging as people clapped and waved. "Look at him," Sarah said, appearing at Emily's side. "He's a natural. You'd think he's done this 100 times. Emily laughed nervously, adjusting Lily's hat as she sat in her stroller. "I wish I had his confidence." As they approached the stage, the mayor greeted them with a warm smile. "Emily, Max, welcome. We're so glad you could join us." Emily shook his hand, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you for doing this. Max is, well, he's something special." The mayor nodded. "He certainly is." The ceremony began with a recounting of Max's heroic actions, first at the beach with Lily and then at the bay. The boy Max had saved, named Charlie, stood beside his father, holding a handmade sign that read, "Thank you, Max." When it was time for Max to take the stage, Emily led him up to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. She knelt beside him, stroking his fur as the mayor presented him with a medal, a simple, gold-plated disc engraved with "Hero of Camden." The crowd erupted into applause, and Emily could feel tears welling up in her eyes. Max sat calmly, his tail wagging, seemingly unfazed by the noise and attention. For a moment, the weight of her grief and loneliness lifted, replaced by pride and gratitude. When the mayor handed her the microphone, Emily hesitated. Public speaking was not her strong suit, but she knew she had to say something. "Thank you," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "Max came into our lives when we needed him the most. I didn't rescue him, he rescued us. He's not just a hero, he's family, and I'll never be able to thank him enough." Her words were met with cheers and applause. Emily looked down at Max, who leaned against her leg, his amber eyes calm and steady. She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in months. After the ceremony, people gathered to pet Max and take pictures with him. Charlie approached shyly, his father encouraging him forward. "Can I pet him?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Emily said, kneeling to Max's level. Max loves kids. Charlie tentatively reached out, his small hand brushing Max's fur. Max wagged his tail, leaning into the boy's touch. Charlie giggled, his earlier nervousness fading. "Thank you, Max," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "You saved me." Emily felt a lump in her throat as she watched the interaction. Moments like this reminded her of how much Max had given, not just to her and Lily, but to everyone he touched. That evening, back at the cottage, Emily hung Max's medal on a hook by the door. She sat on the floor beside him, Lily playing with her toys nearby. "You've had a big day," she said, rubbing his ears. Max sighed contentedly, resting his head on her lap. Emily looked out the window at the setting sun, her heart full. For the first time in a long time, she felt like life was moving forward, not just for her, but for all of them. And she knew, deep down, that none of it would have been possible without Max. The days after the ceremony settled into a new normal for Emily, Lily, and Max. While their lives hadn't fundamentally changed, there was a new rhythm to their little family. The recognition Max received seemed to solidify his place in their home, not that there had ever been any doubt. Lily's bond with Max grew stronger with each passing day. She followed him everywhere, crawling after him in the living room, giggling when he licked her cheek, and pulling herself up to stand by holding onto his thick fur. Max, ever patient, seemed to understand his role as her protector and playmate. He stayed close, never letting her wander too far without his watchful eyes. One morning, as Emily prepared breakfast, she glanced into the living room where Lily sat on the rug, babbling as she handed toys to Max. The dog lay beside her, his tail wagging gently each time Lily pressed a stuffed animal into his fur. "You're her best friend, aren't you?" Emily said softly, smiling as she flipped pancakes on the stove. The knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping her hands on a towel, she opened the door to find Sarah standing there, holding a brightly wrapped package. "Morning," Sarah said cheerfully, stepping inside. "I brought something for Mac." Emily raised an eyebrow. "For Max? What is it?" Sarah placed the package on the table and started unwrapping it. Inside was a plush dog bed with Max's name embroidered on the side. It was large and luxurious, clearly chosen with care. "I figured the town's hero deserved a proper throne," Sarah said with a grin. Emily laughed, shaking her head. "He's going to be spoiled rotten at this rate." "Good," Sarah replied. "He's earned it." Emily placed the bed in the corner of the living room, and Max inspected it curiously. After a few sniffs, he climbed in, circling a few times before settling down with a satisfied huff. Lily crawled over to him, patting the edge of the bed and squealing in delight. "Looks like it's a hit," Emily said, smiling at Sarah. "Thank you." Sarah waved a hand dismissively. "It's the least I could do." "Honestly, Emily, you seem different lately." "Happier." Emily nodded, her gaze softening as she watched Lily and Max. I think. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think Max reminded me that it's okay to move forward, to find joy in little things again." Sarah reached out, squeezing Emily's hand. "You're doing great, you know. I'm proud of you." That afternoon, Emily decided to take Lily and Max on a walk through the town. The sun was warm, and the streets were lively with locals and tourists alike. Max, as always, drew attention. People stopped to pet him, many recognizing him from the ceremony. As they passed the park, a young couple approached, holding the leash of a small terrier. The woman smiled warmly. "This is Max, right? The hero dog?" Emily nodded. "That's him." The couple knelt down, their terrier wagging its tail excitedly as it sniffed Max. "We just wanted to say thank you," the man said. "What he did for that boy was incredible. He's an inspiration." Emily's chest swelled with pride. "He's pretty special," she said, glancing down at Max. I'm lucky to have him. Back at the cottage, as the day wound down, Emily found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed in such a short time. She had started to let go of the overwhelming grief that had once defined her days. Max had given her more than companionship. He had given her purpose. That evening, after Lily was tucked into bed, Emily sat on the porch with Max beside her. The cool breeze carried the scent of the sea, and the sound of waves in the distance filled the quiet night. She reached down, stroking Max's fur. "You know," she said softly, "I don't think I would have made it without you." Max looked up at her, his amber eyes calm and steady. He leaned against her leg, his silent presence more comforting than words ever could be. As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. With Lily in her arms and Max by her side, she had found a way to rebuild her life. A new family dynamic, built on love, trust, and the quiet strength they shared. The brisk autumn air carried the faint scent of leaves and salt water as Emily stepped out onto the porch, Lily balanced on her hip. Max bounded ahead, his golden fur catching the morning light. Camden's charm only seemed to grow with the changing seasons, and Emily found herself drawn to the vibrant reds and oranges of the trees lining their familiar paths. Today, however, was different. Emily was nervous, though she tried not to show it. For months, her world had revolved around Lily and Max, and the routine they had established had become a source of comfort. But this morning, she was taking a step she hadn't dared to consider until now, meeting someone new. The invitation had come from Sarah, of course, who had been gently nudging Emily toward the idea of opening herself up to new possibilities. "It's just coffee," Sarah had insisted. "No pressure, no expectations. Besides, Sam's a great guy. He loves dogs, and he's amazing with kids. Just meet him." Emily had resisted at first, but Sarah's persistent optimism wore her down. "Fine," she'd said eventually, though her stomach had churned at the thought. Now, as she reached the small cafe overlooking Camden Bay, Emily adjusted Lily's coat and took a deep breath. Max walked beside her, his leash loose in her hand. The cafe's windows glowed warmly, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the open door. Inside, a man stood near the counter, holding a cup of coffee and glancing toward the entrance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and an easy smile that reached his eyes. Sarah hadn't exaggerated. Sam exuded a quiet, approachable confidence. When his gaze landed on Emily, his expression softened. "Emily?" he asked, stepping forward. She nodded, shifting Lily slightly on her hip. "Hi, and this is Lily," she said, smiling at her daughter, who was busily chewing on the edge of her bunny. "And Max," she added, gesturing toward the dog at her side. Sam crouched to Max's level, his hand outstretched. "Hey, buddy. I've heard a lot about you." Max sniffed his hand, then wagged his tail, leaning into Sam's touch. Emily relaxed slightly at the sight. Max's approval was no small thing. "Why don't we sit?" Sam suggested, gesturing toward a table by the window. Emily nodded, settling Lily into a high chair while Max lay down at her feet. As they talked, Emily was surprised at how comfortable she felt. Sam was easy to talk to, his questions thoughtful and his laugh genuine. He shared stories about his work as a carpenter and his own dog, a Labrador named Bailey, who he admitted was a bit of a diva. "And you?" Sam asked, leaning forward slightly. "Have you been holding up?" "Sarah told me a little about your story, but only what you were okay with her sharing." Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing over the edge of her coffee cup. "It's been a journey," she said finally. "Losing Michael was the hardest thing I've ever faced. But Lily keeps me going. And Max, well, Max has been my anchor." Sam nodded, his expression serious. "It sounds like you've built something really strong out of something so difficult. That takes a lot of courage." His words touched her, and she found herself smiling. "Thank you," she said quietly. As they finished their coffee, Sam glanced at Max. He said, his tone light. "I think Bailey and Max would get along great. Maybe we could arrange a playdate sometime?" Emily laughed, the suggestion easing some of her lingering nerves. "I think Max would love that. When they stepped outside, the crisp air greeted them again, and Emily felt lighter somehow. Sam waved goodbye, promising to text Sarah to arrange the dog playdate. As he walked away, Max stood beside her, his tail wagging as if in approval. Emily looked down at her daughter, who was babbling happily, and then at Max. "What do you think, Max? Should we see where this goes?" Max wagged his tail again, his amber eyes bright. Emily smiled, her heart lifting with cautious optimism. It wasn't just about meeting someone new. It was about allowing herself to move forward, to open the door to the possibility of joy again. As they walked back toward the cottage, the late morning sun broke through the clouds, warming their path. Emily knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. With Lily in her arms and Max by her side, she was stepping into a future that felt full of hope. Weeks passed, and Emily found herself settling into a rhythm she hadn't anticipated. A balance between her life with Lily and Max and the cautious beginnings of a friendship with Sam. Their dog playdates had become regular outings, with Max and Bailey bounding along the trails near the bay while Emily and Sam chatted, sharing pieces of their lives. It was unhurried and natural, exactly what Emily needed. One chilly November afternoon, Emily bundled Lily in her favorite knit hat and coat, preparing for their daily walk. Max waited patiently by the door, his leash in his mouth. "Ready, Max?" Emily asked, smiling as she clipped the leash to his collar. The familiar path to the bay was quiet, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot. Lily babbled in her stroller, her mittened hands waving at every bird and squirrel they passed. Max walked beside the stroller, his tail wagging as he sniffed the cool air. When they reached the water's edge, Emily stopped to take in the view. The bay shimmered under the pale sunlight, and the gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore brought a sense of calm. She knelt beside Lily, adjusting her hat. "You know, Lily," Emily said softly, "this is where Max came into our lives. Right here. Funny how things work out, isn't it?" Lily gurgled in response, reaching for Max, who nuzzled her hand affectionately. That evening, after Lily was asleep and the cottage was quiet, Emily sat on the couch with Max. She had begun keeping a journal, a way to process her thoughts and reflect on how far she'd come. As she wrote, Max rested his head on her lap, his steady presence grounding her. She flipped back to an earlier entry, written just days after Max had joined their family. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, but Max seems to think I am. Maybe he's right." Emily smiled at the words, her fingers brushing the page. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she murmured, looking down at Max. He thumped his tail in response, his amber eyes warm and knowing. A few weeks later, Emily received a call from the local newspaper. They were putting together a feature on community heroes and wanted to include Max. At first, Emily hesitated. The idea of revisiting the events of the past year felt daunting. But the reporter's enthusiasm was infectious, and Emily realized the story wasn't just about Max's heroics. It was about how he had changed her life. The article, published the following Sunday, featured a large photo of Max with Lily perched on his back, her tiny hands clutching his fur. The headline read, "Max, the Hero Dog: How One Rescue Brought a Family Back to Life." The story touched many in Camden, and Emily was overwhelmed by the messages of support she received. But the most meaningful moment came a few days later when a young woman knocked on her door, holding the hand of a small boy. "Hi," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I read about Max in the paper. I just wanted to say thank you." Emily tilted her head, confused. "Thank you? For what?" The woman knelt, her son stepping forward shyly. "This is Jack," she explained. "When he was a baby, we went through something similar to what you did with Lily. Reading about Max, it reminded me that there are still good things in the world. That hope is worth holding on to." Emily felt her throat tighten as she crouched to Jack's level. "Hi, Jack," she said softly, smiling. "You know, Max would love to meet you." The boy's face lit up as Max ambled over, his tail wagging. Jack giggled as Max licked his hand, and the woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, as Emily sat on the porch with Max, the stars shining brightly above, She reflected on the unexpected ways life had changed since Max had entered her world. He wasn't just her hero. He was a symbol of resilience, of the unbreakable bond between love and hope. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. "You're not just part of the story, Max. You are the story, and I'll never stop being grateful for you." Max wagged his tail, his amber eyes shining with a quiet understanding.